Figure 1, P. Magone's table. Magone 2000, page 236. It is hard to understand why the comparison is drawn only between these two texts. See, here is the Indian version of the myth. The Satapatha Brahmana, saying a pious man, Manu, rescues a small fish, etc. On the Akadian side, men incur divine displeasure. The supreme god Enlil resolves to exterminate them. The fish rewards a man by warning him of approaching deluge. The man pulls his ship. A divine protector Ea adds a pious man by warning him of the approaching deluge. The man pulls his ship. So again, it is hard to understand why the comparison is drawn only between these two texts. The Satapatha Brahmana version is the earliest, and the Indian sequence of version of the myth from the Gilgamesh epic is one of the latest in Mesopotamia. The reason could be that these two texts are almost contemporary as far as the dates of the fixation are concerned. Then it is obvious that P. Magone aimed at rejecting the possibility of a literary borrowing of the myth by Indians from a foreign literary source, the Mesopotamian, about the 6th century BC. But there are as well, we shall see, other ways to explain the similarity and even a genetic connection between the Mesopotamian and Indian flood stories, the ways which will lead us into a quite different historical period. There is also one general methodological objection to the approach suggested by P. Magone. Every myth exists and must be studied as a complex or a corpus or a body of its variants, because sometimes very old motifs may be preserved in a late version, and sometimes the earliest version, the earliest by the date of its fixation, may have been edited or adapted in order to serve some religious or ideological purposes. As a result, some important details may well have been omitted or left out. This seemed to be the case with the Satapatha Brahmana. Its authors had many problems trying to adapt the flood myth to their ritualistic aim, glorifying the Ida ceremony as a means to increase or create a progeny. This is why they omitted any mention of living beings or the seeds of life loaded onto the ship. It would have contradicted their main idea that Manu created the human race through the power of the Ida sacrifice. But P. Magone uses this omission, or what was left out, as one of his key arguments against a genetic connection between the two stories. Having compared the Satapatha myth with the Akkadian version, P. Magone stresses the differences between them. The most important difference for him is that in the Satapatha there is no explanation of the reasons for the flood, while in the beginning of the Akkadian myth it is explained that the flood was sent to humans as a punishment for their sinful deeds. As a sacrifice at the end of the Akkadian myth had a function of reconciliation between gods and men, restoring the interrupted ceremonial exchange between them, while the sacrifice of Manu has exclusively a procreative function. The author's objection was that all these things did not belong to the basic structure of the myth. They were the elements of a religious superstructure which changes even within a single tradition, from one to another stage in religious development, or development of a religion. And we've just seen how the Indian flood myth went through the stages of the Vedic ritualism, epic early Hinduism, and eventually of the Vaishnava Bhakti interpretation, but in spite of some distortions, the basic structure of the myth has remained intact. Excluding all real or imaginary differences from the two flood myths, under comparison, P. Magone leaves us with a common sequence of motifs. It includes no more than this. A chosen pious man is warned of the impending deluge, builds a ship and sails to alight lastly atop a mountain. We end up on top of a mountain, or come to stop on top of a mountain, where he celebrates a sacrifice. But even these residual concordances, generic as they are nevertheless more apparent than real. P. Magone considers these motifs to be generic because there are so many tales where a person or some human survived the flood, floating on its waters in a boat, though sometimes they do it in a pumpkin, a hollow log, a ceramic pot, a musical instrument, a drum, a flute, etc. The survivor landed on the top of a mountain is a generic motive because, as P. Magone said in our online discussion at a certain website, what else is left when the lowlands are flooded? Possible answers are a high tree, a rock, the back of a gigantic turtle, a fish, an aquatic animal, etc. The water could sink at all by itself or by the will of a god. As far as the reality of these concordances is concerned, the author tried to prove that they were not imaginary at all, and that there are some other points of similarity between the Indian and the Mesopotamian flood myths that have not been noticed before. His aim, and some others' aim, was to produce their own table of concordances between the Mesopotamian and Indian flood myths. In their main versions, but before that it would be reasonable to discuss each relevant motive separately. To begin with, the author liked to draw attention to the previous neglected fact that the two main personages of the flood myth in both traditions share some common characteristics. The protagonist, the survivor of the flood in all Mesopotamian and all Indian versions, is not merely a chosen pious man. He is always a king, but with some priestly functions. A sacral king, a priest king, a king who performs sacrifices, who is the bearer and the guardian of the highest religious values. This created serious problems to the compilers of the Satapatha Brahmana, as footnote indication here, but was in perfect harmony with the sacral character of a ruler's power in early Sumer, and probably in the Indus Valley civilization as well. And the footnote says, from the Brahmin's point of view, performance of sacrifices by the king himself was a heretical and barbarian practice. Example, you can see the example, Mahabharata 8:27-81, pages 30, it's got 30 there, 70 or 71. Mahabharata 1990, 10213, 113. But it was in perfect harmony with the sacred character of a ruler's power in early Sumer, and probably in the Indus Valley civilization as well. In the Indo-Aryan culture, in spite of the Brahmins' efforts to monopolize all ritual activities, the king in many regions still retained some priestly functions, fertility magic, rain-making, etc. Ralph, 1957, 90, Vassilkov, 2010, 142, 147. Thus, this specific characteristic of a protagonist forms the first significant concordance in both traditions. Then there's a benefactor. In his analysis, P. Magnoni stresses the difference between the images of the benefactor, example, the character who warns the protagonist of the impending flood, in two sources: in the Sapatha Brahmana, the fish, not identified with any particular god, and in the Mesopotamian, the Sumerian Enki, the Akkadian ear, the god of waters, the benefactor of mankind and the founder of civilization. But this difference may be somewhat diminished if we take into account the fact that the Sumero-Babylonian Enki/ear had a fish as a symbol, that his constant companion, and probably his partial incarnation, Kululu, had a form of a half man, half fish. Remember that? It looked like he was actually wearing a fish in those ancient depictions. Like a man was wearing a complete giant fish, but he was half man, half fish. His mythical priests and assistants, the teachers of mankind, 7 wise sages, Apkallu, represented in the Neo-Babylonian reliefs as men in fish dress, or as half men, half fish. The same form was ascribed by Berosus to Anes, the divine teacher of mankind, who came out of the waters, most probably a continuation of the ancient figure of Kululu. Seeds of life in animal-human pairs. The building of a ship by a protagonist seems to be the only motive P. Magnoni is prepared to recognise as common, but he sees the great difference in the description of the cargo loaded on board. In the Akadian myth, it is always a question of human or animal, couples or in any case complete beings. In the Indian myths, it is always a question of seeds, Magnoni 2000, 237. If he had included some other versions, both Indian and Mesopotamian, into his analysis, or if he had used some other translation of the myth from the Gilgamesh epic, he would have seen that this is not the case. In the Sumerian flood story, it is said that Ziusudra preserved the seed of mankind, Kramer 1981, 153, Emelianov 2009, 220. In the Gilgamesh epic, the god orders Utnapishtim to take the seed of all souls into the ship. Igor M. Diakonov, in his poetic Russian translation, wrote, takes aboard everything living, but gave this literal translation in this commentary. In the Bible, Noah is told to take on board pairs of all living beings in order to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. Genesis 7, 2-3. Indian sources too speak both of seeds and of living beings. In the Mahabharata, the fish, Brahma, orders Manu to take on board all the seeds. Bijani, Savani, keeping them there separately. Bagasa cannot it mean by peace? And Manu before the flood takes Bijani Savani with him on the ship. Mahabharata 185-30-34, Mahabharata 1975-584. In the Matsya Purana, the Vishnu instructs Manu that he has to save living beings of all kinds. Footnote indication. They are living beings of different origin, born of sweat, born of eggs, born of water, and those who slow their skins. What does that mean? Okay, so he has to save all living beings of all kinds in the ship, especially built by God's protection of the great multitude souls, Jiva, Impur 130-31. But in the subsequent more detailed instruction, Manu's aim is formulated differently. He has to take on board the seeds of all living beings, Sattva Bijani Savasa, Impur 210. In the Bhagavata Purana, the fish orders Manu to collect all the seeds of high and low kind, and need to come on board in the company of 7 rishis and all kind of living beings, Savastavani 8:24-34. So as we see, both traditions speak sometimes in the same one text, both of the seed of life and of the pairs of, or merely of a selection of various living beings on board. It seems that the two expressions are interchangeable, almost synonymous, or to be exact, the seeds in both traditions served as a metaphor for a minimal selection of specimens, sufficient for the survival of a species. The above quoted text from the Bible, Genesis 7:2-3, leaves no doubt about the identity of the pairs and the seed. In addition, it may be noticed that the Sanskrit word bija, seed, is of Indo-Iranian antiquity. Footnote indication 3. It is noteworthy that in Jones's translation we find surprisingly pairs of all brute animals. Jones 1799-240. There are two possible explanations. Either W. Jones used a different version of the text, or maybe he was too eager to demonstrate the similarity, if not the identity, of the Puranic and the Mosaic stories. In addition, it may be noticed that the Sanskrit word bija, I wonder if that's where the word bhuja, those sort of spicy seeds and noodles and all that, you eat that stuff, you eat the Indian one. Yeah, very nice. I wonder if that's where that word comes from, bhuja or bhuji, isn't of Indo-Iranian antiquity, whereas in the Indo-Iranian, bij was a borrowing from an unknown substract language. In Witzel is inclined to think that it was probably the language of the Bactria Margiana culture, 2100 to 1900 BCE. Witzel, 1999-65. But an unknown language of the Indus Valley civilization seems to be a plausible candidate too. Yeah, looks like there's a footnote indication somewhere. In the old Iranian biza, semen is used only as part of names. In the Avestan flood myth story of Yuma from Vidyavat 2:25, the seed of animals which Yuma has to preserve is designated by the word chivra. Semen, seed. I am grateful for this information, as he's thinking this particular professor. The number 7. The number 7 is very popular in the Near Eastern descriptions of the flood. The storm continues for 7 days and 7 nights in the scenes of the story. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the storm lasts for 6 days and 7 nights and stops on the 7th day. On the 7th day after that, Utnapishtim releases a dove. Then he uses 7 plus 7 incense burners in the final sacrifice. Atrahasis in the story has only 7 days for his preparation. Then a storm breaks and a flood that lasts for 7 days. In the Bible, Noah has to take with him pairs of clean beasts and of the fowls of the air by sevens. Genesis 7:2-3. And remember, to Genesis 7:2-3. And remember Lamech, if Cain was killed, or someone killed Cain, it'd be 7 times 70. See the favoritism of 7. The storm and the deluge really come after 7 days, Genesis 17. Then, in the 7th month of the flood, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8-5. Noah sent birds in search of dry land, with intervals of 7 days, Genesis 8-10-12. In the Indian versions, this number is used less frequently, but is still present. In the Bhagavata Purana, 8:24.33, exactly as in the story of Atrahasis in the Bible, the flood starts on the 7th day after the God's warning. In the Matsya Purana, before the deluge, 7 cruel rays will destroy living beings, 7 times 7 rays will rain down hot coals, and after that 7 clouds of doomsday will flood the earth. It is possible to see in these details the influence of the Puranic descriptions of the Pralaya, the destruction of everything at the end of the world, period. Compare Gonzalez-Ryman 2006 226. But one can hardly doubt that the Puranic imagery of the Pralaya was inspired by the much more ancient image of the universal catastrophe, example of the flood. Suffice it to say that the classical description of the Pralaya ends with the picture of the boundless waters of the universal flood, upon which Vishnu floats asleep with all the worlds inside him. Vishnu himself is here a kind of ark with the whole universe as its cargo. Of special interest is another group of 7 in the Indian flood stories. For the first time, the 7 sages Rishi appear in the Mahabharata as Manu, companions on board of a ship. Manu's companions on board of a ship. They are not only passengers but act as members of the crew. Tie the ship with the rope to the mountain. Mahabharata 3, 185.45-46. However, their main function is certainly different. They are keepers and embodiments of the Vedic wisdom that must be taught anew after the flood. There is no mention of them in the Matsya Purana. A possible explanation is that in it the ship itself is Vedanu. How do you say that? Vedanu, maybe Vedanu, the Veda ship built by the gods, and after the flood it is the great Vishnu himself who proclaims the Vedas. But the Bhagavata Purana brings him back into the story. Bhag per 7:24-34-37. Numerous miniatures and popular prints demonstrate that the image of the 7 rishis is inseparable from the picture of the flood in the traditional Hindu consciousness. The analogy with the 7 Babylonian Apkallu, Sumerian Abgal, who are never mentioned directly in the known Mesopotamian versions of the flood myth, may seem too far-fetched if we do not take into account that these 7 demigods, half fish, half human, priest of Enki or Ea, were sent by him from the water abyss to the dry land in order to teach the first races of humans the basics of civilization, such as religion, writing, laws, arts, architecture, etc. They also served as advisors to 7 antediluvian kings. After the flood, several Apkallu, the text mentioned for them, appeared again in the same role of teachers and advisors. The parallel, of course, is far from complete, but the common function of the keepers and teachers of wisdom leaves, it seems to the author, a small possibility of a genetic connection between the two groups. That's India and Mesopotamia. And here's a footnote down here. The Satapatha Brahmana did not need their presence in the narrative, the world of humans, and to be recreated exclusively through the Ida sacrifice performed by Manu, without help from any mythical beings. And you have the northern mountain. Landing on top of a mountain, as it had been mentioned, is not a unique motive. Yet its occurrence in 2 otherwise identical narrative sequences cannot be merely incidental or accidental. It is worthy of noting that in both traditions, this mountain is usually placed somewhere in the north. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, 11:140, it is Mount Nitsir, now Mount Per Omar Gudrun, and 450 kilometers to the north of Shuripapak. Epos of Gilgamesh, 1961, that would be the Epic of Gilgamesh. 206, the italics are mine, Ya.V. Berossus preferred to Mount Cordina in Armenia, which was also situated to the north of Mesopotamia. According to the Bible, the ark landed upon the mountains of Ararat. Well, supposedly, but why would it be way up the top at its peak where it's totally freezing? Yeah, God's supposed to allow these people to survive, to live on. Why would he put them, let the ark go way up there and they freeze to death? Okay, so apparently it was actually not on top of the mountain, it was like at a lower plane, but below the mountain. We've read somewhere else. According to the Bible, the ark landed upon the mountains of Ararat, Genesis 8:4. In a similar way, the Satapatha Brahmana 1.5-6 speaks of the northern mountain, whereas the Mahabharata of the highest peak of the Himalayas 3:185-44-47. Of course, the early civilizations of Mesopotamia and northern India both emerged in river valleys on the plains bordering on the mountains of the north. However, there is some probability that the motifs of a northern mountain in both traditions have a common origin. And the final sacrifice of Upanishtum, etc. Here's some comparisons here. Near East, the protagonist, a king with some priestly function, the benefactor. God with a fish symbolism, supernatural fish god in the form of a fish. So these are similarities here. The boarding of a ship by a protagonist, accepted as a common motif by P. Magnolia. Seeds of life and animal-human pairs, synonymous or interchangeable elements in both traditions. The use of the number 7 in particular. 7 sages Apkalu, 7 sages Rishis. So yeah. Saving the highest values of religion and civilization from the flood. These introduced one more important common thing. Saving the highest values of religion and civilization from the flood. This common element is most clearly expressed in the late versions, Berosus in Mesopotamia, Bhagavata and Agni Puranas in India, landing upon the northern mountain and final sacrifice. Thus, we can see that there really is a common sequence of basic motifs. However, in the Mesopotamian text, we find some recurring motifs that are absent from the Sanskrit or Indian versions of the flood myth. It is time now to discuss them, specifically Mesopotamian motifs. Firstly, in all the main Mesopotamian versions, stories of Ziusudra, Unutpishtim and Atrahasis, there is a motif of betraying the secret of gods by Enki/Ea in a speech addressed not directly to the protagonist, but to a wall in his house, made of reed. It never features in the Indian flood myths. There is only one motif in the world folklore which is probably related to this element of the Mesopotamian myth. This is the motif of the king's secret, or of the speaking reeds in the story of King Midas and its transformation. Is that a Greek story? Not really sure. It deserves to be mentioned that as a result of a special analysis of the story, its origin has been traced to approximately 2000 BCE, and geographically to the story, its origin has been traced to approximately 2000 BCE, and geographically to southern Iran. Example, to the territory bordering on the Indus civilization, Moscovic, Stuli, 1967, 135 to 136. Another interesting motif is common to all Near Eastern versions, but it is not known to the Indian sources. It is a motif of birds, released by the survivor from the ark, and sent as scouts to find a dry land. The motif is very important because it may help us define the cultural and historical milieu in which at least the Near Eastern myths have taken shape. Generally speaking, the motif of birds sent as scouts is universally spread, but almost always, with the exception of the Near Eastern myth, it is a god who sends the birds. Sometimes the flood is merely the first stage in the process of creation. The world is still covered with water, and the god sends birds or aquatic animals to find some material out of which he can make dry land. Or the god, in his wrath or his fury, anger, destroys human beings, but then repents and sends birds to find out if there are any survivors left. Okay, it's like in the Bible where it repented God who made man. So, he had to destroy them because of their wickedness over the entire geographical world, right? Location. Yeah. He had a change of heart. It made him sad, right? Basically. So he changed his mind, right? Or something like that. Gave him another option, right? Second chance sort of thing. The Near Eastern flood myth is an absolutely unique case. Here, the protagonist, the survivor, sends birds to find some dry land where the ark could land, and the origin of this motive can be explained only one way. This motive betrays the acquaintance of the mythmakers with the practice of navigation in the open sea. We are familiar with the description of this ancient practice made much later, in historical times. The Vikings, example, discovered Iceland using birds as scouts. They had a cage with ravens on board, and in the open sea would periodically release one bird. If there was no land around, the birds would naturally circle the ship and return. If land was near, the raven would fly toward it, and the ship had merely to follow it. There is still an idiom in English: as a crow flies, example, directly to the aim. About the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, intensive maritime trade was established between Mesopotamia and another hydraulic civilization of a similar cultural type in the east, the Indus Harappan civilization. Trade routes went mostly along the coast, but sometimes sailors could find themselves in the open seas and would use birds as scouts. The practice was well known to the Mesopotamians, and not to them only, but to their trade partners in the east too. Moreover, it is quite probable that the practice of using birds was brought to Mesopotamia by sailors from the Indus civilization, Sumerian Meluha, because the initiative in establishing long-distance maritime trading contacts most likely belonged to the Indians. Mesopotamian texts speak of Meluhan ships in the Gulf and in the harbour of Akkad, but nothing is said about Sumerian or Babylonian merchants sailing directly to Meluha during Casper's 1979-64 Goshk Steams 2007-12. Probably a vague memory of a very remote past was reflected in the Buddhist Bavaru. Jaktaka Bavaru is the Indian name for Babylon. It is told there how Indian merchants came to Bavaru, the country where at that time were no birds at all, and for a great sum of money sold to the local people a crow, which they, for an unknown reason, had on their ship, number 339, Minayev, 1870. The important evidence in favour of the Harappans' acquaintance with the practice of sending birds as scouts is provided by a picture on a moulded terracotta tablet depicting a ship with 2 birds on it. There can be no doubt that this is a mythological image, not merely a fantasy of the artist. If this is the case, this image indicates that the Indus people most probably knew the flood myth we're talking about, or shared knowledge about it with the Mesopotamians in the version which included the motive of sending birds. We also know that the descendants of the Indus people, the so-called late Harappans, had close cultural contacts with the early Indo-Aryans, the painted grey ware culture in the Sarasvati Valley, and this could well have been a route by which the flood myth penetrated into the Indo-Aryan mythological tradition. However, at the time of the Satapatha Brahmana, the Vedic Aryans were moving to the southeast along the Ganges Valley, having a very vague idea of the sea and of practices of maritime navigation. Well, the Indians actually had a trade route to India, and then it's through the Suez Canal, which the Egyptians were working on, all that sort of stuff. The Nile, it shows you in the Grand Bible, the picture, I think it's page 8 or something like that. It looks like a flat earth. The green area of Egypt, and gives you great detail on the Indian trade route. Yeah, so they may have caught leprosy and took it back to India. That's from other information, another book that we found. Because there was leprosy, high rates of leprosy in Egypt and also in India at that time, or at some point, right? Okay. The iniquity of the flood myths in India. There are some reason to suppose that the history of the flood myth in all Sanskrit literature did not begin with the Satapatha Brahman. Now, first of all, there is the brief mention of the flood, Manu and his final sacrifice in the Kathaka Samhita 11.2, of the Black Yajurveda, Histaman 1983-28, which could hardly have been later than the Satapatha Brahmana. Secondly, the reading of Atharvaveda 1939.8, by W.D. Whitney, Atharva Veda 1905 960 to 961, which presented this verse as containing no mention of a ship on the mountain and therefore excluded it from any discussion of the Indian flood myth, has been proven to be erroneous. The text mentions the highest peak in the Himalayas, the place of the ships gliding down, Navaprabhamisana. The action expressed here by a derivative from the verb Brahms, Satapatha Brahmana 1983-218 note 1, completely agrees with the situation described in the Satapatha. The fish orders Manu to tie the ship to a tree on the mountain so that when the waters start to subside it could gradually glide down together with them. Anu Ava, too short there, Sirip. He did so, and that is why a slope of this northern mountain is called Manoravasapana. Example, the place of Manu is gliding down gradually. The verbs are different, but they designate the same action. The name of the mountain in the Mahabharata, No Bandhana, the place of tying the ship to a tree, reflects another aspect of the same situation. Lastly, the author wanted to summarize briefly the results of the research with which he got acquainted only after his return from the Yerevan conference of IACM. A St. Petersburg Indologist and linguist, Evgenia Kryuchkova, in an article A Ship in the Rig Veda, Kryuchkova 2014, analysed all the instances of the use of the word nautical boat, ship in the Rig Veda, and also studied some material from other Vedic texts. The word is used predominantly in simile and metaphors. In the overwhelming majority of cases, the image of a ship has a positive meaning as a symbol of saving life and of the gods' benevolence. In all comparative constructions, the ship as an object of comparison refers, according to E.R. Kryuchkova, not a plain boat used in everyday life, but to a mythical ark, the ship of salvation, the sign of mercy shown by God or gods to the righteous. In the author's opinion, this Rigvedic image of the ship may be traced back to the deluge myth, Kryuchkova 2014 177. The data presented in the article convinced the author, etc., that the myth of the Great Flood had been known to the early Indo-Aryans since the very beginning of the Vedic culture. And that's from Yaroslav Vassilkov, Department of South and Southwestern Asia, Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography, Kunstkamera, 3 University Embankment, 2 St. Petersburg, 199,034 Russia. And there was this